Be turning to Acts 18. We'll be looking at least the first 17 verses. If I get done quick with that, we might go a little further. This is Paul as he visits Corinth for the first time. Does anybody remember where Paul was last week? He was in Athens. And of course, in the weeks before that, we read about his first missionary journey. There's a pattern here that develops. Where does Paul usually go first when he goes to visit a new city? Synagogue. Usually goes to the synagogue. He knows that the Jews are meeting there. There's also some Gentiles that show up, believers in Jehovah God, worshipers of Jehovah God. And he begins there to teach and preach the gospel, to reach both Jews and Greeks and Gentiles with the gospel. And it seems that he has this pattern of going to the synagogue every time he goes to a new city. He starts there. And what usually happens? Does he have success?
No.
Well, sometimes he has success, but almost always he has a little persecution and a little opposition that's going along too. They're aware of this. Jesus told them there would be opposition, but they don't shy away from that. And we're going to see that today because Corinth was a very worldly city. If you were to pick a place to plant a church, you probably wouldn't pick Corinth as your first pick. And we'll look at some of those reasons here in a minute. So in Athens, in Antioch, Pisidian Antioch, in Derbe, in some of these other places where he had gone before, they have success, but they also have opposition. And usually it's the Jews that oppose him for one reason or another. They're jealous of his following, and they're jealous because he's preaching Christ as the Messiah. And they'll stir up trouble. And in these different cities, they'll cause a riot. It was in one city, they stoned him and left him for dead. And that wasn't that long ago. As we're reading through the book of Acts, it was just a few chapters back that he was stoned. But yet he presses on. And he has folks with him. He's got Timothy and Silas that's following along with him. Previously, he had Barnabas and John Mark. They're going their own way now. Paul and Silas and Timothy are going through Asia Minor right now. So we pick up in Acts 18. Let's read the first 17 verses, and then we'll get into the study. Chapter 18, Acts 18, verse 1. After this, Paul left Athens and he went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed with them and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. So he's following his same pattern. He goes to a new town, he starts in the synagogue. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to the preaching and testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when the Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest, and he said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clear of my responsibility. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue ruler, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many Corinthians who heard him also believed and were baptized. So we have success, we have opposition. Finishing 9 through 17, I'll go ahead and read that. One night the Lord spoke to Paul, and in a vision he said, "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack or harm you. because I have many people in this city. So Paul stayed there for a year and a half, teaching them the word of God. While Gallio, a proconsul of Achaia, the Jews While Gallio was proconsul of Aquila, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him into court. This man, they charged, is persuading the people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law. Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, if you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names in your own law, settle this matter among yourselves. I will not be a judge in such things. So he had them ejected from court, and then they all turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue ruler, and beat him in front of the court. And Gallio showed no concern whatever. So that's our text that we're going to begin with today. And then I want to talk a little bit about the who, what, when, where, and why. And then we're going to talk about Corinth. And then we're going to get into the text a little more. So Paul now has gone to Corinth. Who does he meet first off? Aquila and Priscilla. This is the first time we're introduced to them. That's not the last time we're going to hear about Aquila and Priscilla. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth about them in a minute. Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So Paul, Aquila, Priscilla, Claudius. There's Jews and Greeks and Christians in this text. Silas and Timothy come to join. There's the guy next door to the synagogue. His name was Titius Justus. And then the first synagogue ruler, his name was Crispus. And he became a believer, him and his household, along with many other Corinthian believers. The Lord is in this text because he gives a vision to Paul in the night. Gallio or Gallio, however you say that, he's the proconsul of Achaia. And then the synagogue ruler that took over, I suppose, after Crispus was converted, his name was Sosthenes. So those are the characters that are in the text. And we've already established the where. It's in Corinth. So what's going on in this text? Somebody tell me what's the main thing or the main theme of this text? What's going on? Kind of already alluded to. Him spreading the gospel and having some success, but also some opposition. Kind of following the same pattern here. Seems like everywhere Paul goes, he either starts a riot or gets thrown out of town, or he finds out about some plot to take his life, and they sneak him away and get him out of town kind of quietly, and then he just goes on somewhere else. But he continues on. The other thing that I see as a theme of this text is, do you find it interesting that the other thing that happened in the other cities is that once Paul met opposition, what did he do? Take the dust off his clothes and move on. What happened here? He stayed a year and a half.
But God told him to.
But probably because of the vision that was given to him. If he was going to follow his same pattern, then he may have gotten discouraged and just moved on. But instead of doing that, the Lord said, I've got many people in this city. I want you to keep on speaking. Don't stop preaching. Nobody's going to harm you. I'm with you. Stay here. And he does. He stays a year and a half. How many other cities had he stayed a year and a half in up to this point? Don't think any. Now, after this, he spends a couple years in Ephesus, I think, after he spends a year and a half here in Corinth. And then in In some other places where he was in jail, so he had to spend time there. But he didn't spend a lot of extended time in these cities except for Corinth and Ephesus. He spent a couple years there each time. He was in Antioch for a year, and that was his base for his missionary journeys, where he would go out for a year and a half visiting all these and then come back and report to Antioch, Syria. But yes, he did. He did stay in Antioch for like a year before he went out on his missionary journeys.
Was Corinth a difficult church, as we read in 1 Corinthians? Had a lot of problems, and I'm sure that he recognized that at this point, that he shook his raiment. There was a movie called Jazz Singers. Every time I think about tearing their clothes or showing some disgust, the jazz singer, Neil Diamond, he was a Jew. He kind of went his own way, and he found that he tore his clothes to show his opposition to his family.
And we read about that a lot in the Old Testament, how they tore their clothes. And actually, God told them not to do that, wasn't it, Jim? Did he tell them not to rend their clothes at some point? Or I'm not even sure what that means. It was something to do with the Jews when they would tear their clothes or shake the dust off their feet and the sandals and their clothes. And that was a
sign of grief or disgust.
A sign of disgust and
I think what you're
grief.
referring to when you told them not to grieve over the punishment he was doing.
That's a very good point, Mike. Thank you. Okay, well, let's look at what was difficult about Corinth, since Bruce, you kind of helped take us there. Corinth was an ancient city. It was founded in like 900 BC. So we've got 900 years of history here before we get to the first century about Corinth, and it was a strategic location that was built up and destroyed several times by several nations before in the previous 900 years. Even Alexander the Great came in and took over Corinth in 332 BC. Then the Romans totally destroyed Corinth in 146 BC, but then Julius Caesar totally rebuilt it as a city and a province in 44 BC. So even though it was an ancient city, being rebuilt as recently as 44 BC, they had fairly new buildings, even though it was an ancient city. So it made it attractive. It made it an attractive place to be because the buildings were fairly recent. The thing that made Corinth so strategic, I found this interesting, is if you look at a map, you've got Greece that comes down, and there's a narrow peninsula or an isthmus, and then it widens back out to the bottom part of the peninsula. Corinth was situated right on this. There was a 3.5 mile wide strip of land that separated the two seas. One was the Ionian Sea, and the other side was the Aegean Sea. And what they would do was the ships would sail into the port of Corinth, and they would unload their goods, and they would have people portage across their cargo and load it on a ship on the other side. Well, this saved them hundreds of miles of sailing around the peninsula. So it was a very strategic location, and that made this very busy because it was also on a north to south, kind of a northeast to southwest land route where all of the trade routes took care of. And then you had the sea route from the west to the east or the east to the west, and you could portage across 3.5 miles of land. And if it was a small boat, they'd just pick the boat up and take the boat across 3.5 miles. They'd probably roll it on some kind of a cart or wheels and get it across, and it would save months of sailing around the peninsula. So very strategic place. I had read that it was possibly the fifth largest city at the time. And this was 50, 51, 52 AD. That's also when Gallio was in office, was 51, 52 AD. So we can establish the actual timeline here of when this took place. Possibly the fifth largest city in the area at the time. There was more than 200,000 people living there in 50 AD. And because it was on this land trade route and cut across that the narrow strip of land from one sea to the other, there were thousands of people that traveled through there every year. So this made it very attractive place to plant a church. But it was also a very challenging place to plant a church, like Bruce was saying, because it was a very worldly city. Here's just some of the temples that were in place in Corinth in 50 AD. There were statues to Greek gods everywhere in the city. There were temple prostitutes. There were temples to Hercules, Poseidon, Athena, Hermes, Asclepius, Hygeia, Apollo, Aphrodite, Demeter, and Persephone. And that's probably not even all of them. There were temples to all these other gods just all over the place. The Greek influence was almost as strong as the Roman influence in Corinth in the first century. And this made it a very challenging place to plant a church. But nevertheless, Paul never shies away from that sort of thing. And he goes to Corinth, and the first thing he meets, the first ones that he meets is Aquila and Priscilla. Now, a lot of times, she's named first. We'll hear Priscilla and Aquila. And don't know why that is, but that gives a lot of honor to a lady when she's named first before her husband. We'll find out later, it's not in our text today, but later in the chapter, Aquila and Priscilla are in Ephesus when Paul leaves Corinth and goes to Ephesus. And there they hear a man named Apollo teaching in the synagogue, and he knows his scriptures. And he is teaching the gospel. He's teaching the way. And there was something that Aquila and Priscilla heard about the way he was preaching. They invite him into their home, and the way it says it is they teach him a more excellent way. So they heard something about what he was teaching, and they very lovingly took him aside and corrected him. And he keeps on preaching because as we read of the work in Ephesus, he's still continuing to preach along with Aquila and Priscilla doing the work in Ephesus, even after Paul moves on. So Paul goes to Corinth and he meets Aquila and Priscilla right away. They were probably there first by the time Paul got there. And they had left Rome because Claudius had ordered the Jews out of Rome. So they were previously Jews. We're assuming they're Jewish Christians now. One commentary I read said that Paul may have converted them. But if you just read the text there, it sounds like they were already mature Christians at that point. So I think you could make a strong argument that Aquila and Priscilla were already Christians by the time Paul meets them in Corinth. And if you want to think otherwise, I don't think that changes anything. We can debate about that, but it's not that important. What was their trade? They were tent makers. What did Paul do for a living? He's a tent maker. We got a connection there. And he stays with them. He works with them as a tent maker. He works out of their home and then goes to the synagogue and teaches and preaches. At first, he has a lot of success. He even converts the synagogue ruler, Crispus. But then they get mad at him and they kick him. They tell him not to come back. He shakes off the dust off of his clothes. And I don't think when it says here that he abandons the Jews and spends most of his time with the Gentiles, I don't think he totally abandoned the Jews. Maybe here in Corinth for a time, but he did change his focus more toward just the Gentiles because of the opposition he was receiving.
Well, Justus, even after he made that comment that he'd go to the Gentiles, Justus, who also was a Jew, worshiped God, joined the Christian. So even it wasn't immediate that he turned to the Gentiles.
Right.
The focus was on the Jews still yet.
As long as they were open, as long as they were open to the gospel, anybody was welcome. He wouldn't turn anybody away.
Well, Lydia in her household worshiped the Lord too. Ethiopian Union, I think, was a reading scripture. So people had a background in the Old Testament. And I think he began there, as he did with Ethiopian Union.
Right.
Preaching a more perfect way.
Exactly. Thank you, Bruce.
I think we kind of misunderstand. I mean, I'm not fully understand what it seems like. We kind of have a picture of somebody, Paul converts somebody and they go to another church. But it's like in this situation, most of the Christians were still worshiping in the synagogue. They just became Messianic Jews.
Okay.
Way I kind of picture.
I kind of see both of that happening. Mike, if you didn't hear that online, Mike was saying that once they become believers in Christ as the Messiah, they became Messianic Jews, and they still worshiped in the synagogue. So, and then there may have been a mix of Jews.
Gentiles would be able to do that. They need their own house church.
Right. And the Gentiles wouldn't fit into that situation. So there's where you have the church homes. That was another thing about Aquila and Priscilla. In one of Paul's writings, he mentioned that the church met in Aquila and Priscilla's home at a later date. So, okay. So he goes next door, and next door to the synagogue is where we've established that. Yeah, it's either it's Titius Justus or just Justus, whatever. He lives next door. He becomes a Christian, and then it mentions that Crispus, the synagogue ruler, also becomes a Christian. That had to cause some ripples, don't you think, in the synagogue? And that's the success that Paul was having in spreading the gospel. Okay, now we're at verse 9. So Paul has had some success. The synagogue ruler has become a Christian. He quits going to the synagogue and he goes next door, and that guy that lives next door, him and his household become believers and are baptized. And then, verse 9, it says, one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Do not keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you. No one's going to attack or harm you, because I have many people in this city. We're not really told if Paul was thinking about cutting short his visit and moving on. But certainly this vision would play a role in his decision to stay, because the next verse says Paul stayed there for 1.5 years. And we've already said that that's not been what he normally has done. He'll spend 1.5 years to go to several cities and then report back to Antioch. But when he gets to Corinth, and this is on the second missionary journey, he actually stays there 1.5 years. There's a lot of problems in this city. It is a very worldly city. It's a very promiscuity is rampant in this city. A lot of people went to this city to make their fortunes. The other people went there to swindle people out of their fortunes after they made their fortune. So you got all these characters that are coming into this metropolis, and you got good guys, you got bad guys, you got slave, you got free, you got rich, you got poor, you got Greek influences, you got Roman influences, and if anyone that's read 1st and 2nd Corinthians knows that there were many problems in the first century church in Corinth. But Paul still calls them brothers. Paul corrects them with the writings, and when he visits back through there again. And we have every indication that the church flourished in Corinth, even among all of this worldliness and idolatry in this metropolis city. So Paul has this vision. And if he had been thinking about moving on, he changes his mind because it says he stayed there a year and a half. And then we know that Aquila and Priscilla stayed there with him. How many times have you gotten discouraged? The world's a tough place. The world can gut punch you when you ain't looking. We all get discouraged, and I think this is a time when Paul could have very well gotten discouraged, but he had Aquila and Priscilla right there beside him to encourage him. He had the vision from the Lord to encourage him, and we know that he changed his mind and he stayed there, and he had much success preaching the gospel in Corinth. That's one of the things that I got out of this lesson is that we all need encouragement from time to time. We need each other. We need to pray for each other. We need to bear one another's burdens. We need to challenge each other. There's times when maybe I'm not doing everything that I should or could be doing, and I need a brother to come up and tap me on the shoulder, give me a hug, and say, hey, you need to do better. We can do that for each other. I think we're obligated to do that for each other. We need to confess our sins to one another. That's how we continually are cleansed from our sins. So that type of encouragement, I think, is one of the best things that we can get out of this reading here today. Any other comments before we look at the rest of the reading?
I was interested in the phrase earlier. Roderick said the Jews
Where he abused them?
where they resisted and blasphemed. That would have been blasphemy against God the Father. That would have been blasphemy.
Yes.
So it was.
What verse are you in? I don't think mine.
6.
Okay.
What was your saying?
Mine says became abusive, but I did read that somewhere else in the other material that I was reading is that it was called blasphemy. What version you got there? CBS?
It's the Christian Standard Bible.
CSB, Christian Standard Bible. And it actually says that they blasphemed against Jesus. So,
Which would signify again that they weren't going with God.
and that would classify as being abusive. So, yes. Interesting. Yes, go ahead.
A number of years ago, we were studying Corinthians in Wednesday night class, and I taught a certain portion of this Corinthians, several portions. But one thing I learned from several of the commentaries that I read was that people would call you a Corinthian as a slur.
Yeah.
It was such a worldly city, and there were so many things going on that being from Corinth was a bad thing. You didn't want to do that, and people would call you a Corinthian when they were mad at you.
It wasn't a compliment. It was an insult. Very good. Thank you for that comment. Okay, let's look briefly at the opposition took Paul to court in front of this proconsul, and it's Gallio or Galeo or however you say that. I don't know how you pronounce it exactly, but they were saying that this man is teaching that to worship God in ways that's contrary to the law. And Gallio said, that's not my problem, that's your problem. Y'all handle that. If you have some misdemeanor or some crime that this guy committed, I'll be glad to hear about that. But if it's just a little squabble over your law and how you want to worship God, y'all handle that. And then he just kind of threw the case out of court. And then it says that they become abusive toward Sosthenes and started to beat him, and Gallio showed no concern whatever. I don't know why they turned on Sosthenes, who was the new synagogue ruler. I guess it took over after Crispus had become a Christian. But it backfired. It backfired on them. God said, I'll be with you. Nobody's going to harm you. No one's going to attack you. And it worked out. Not only was the case thrown out of court, but the crowd just kind of turned on the Jewish synagogue leader instead. So kind of backfired on him. Just a couple more things about Aquila and Priscilla. As we mentioned, sometimes in Scripture, Priscilla was named first, which is kind of an honor toward the woman. Priscilla was named before Aquila. We mentioned that they left Rome and came to Corinth because Claudius had ordered all the Jews out of Rome. We know that they were tent makers, same as Paul. They worked together with Paul as tent makers and then shared in the work and the spreading of the gospel. If we were to keep on reading in this chapter and the next chapter, we'll see that Paul leaves Corinth after a year and a half and goes to Ephesus. Aquila and Priscilla go with him. They follow him there and continue the work in Ephesus with Paul, and possibly in other places too.
I feel like Aquila was the predominant person in the beginning, and then as the maturity of Christians, I think Priscilla probably had a stronger mission, just like Paul changed Saul. And so that's what I read, that she was not that she was any better than him, but she was more understanding of what was going on.
I just see them as a team, as a husband and wife team.
Change names, what I said.
And them as them working together, and possibly in some areas she could become more prominent. That may be why she was named first before him. But that's quite an honor for a woman back in these days to take honor, take first billing.
Well, their mission was probably different in terms of spreading the gospel. When Paul was changed to Paul, when he was Saul, he had a different mission.
And then we know that in Paul's other letters, he mentions Priscilla and Aquila several other times. In Romans 16:3, he mentions them. In 1 Corinthians 16:19, he mentions them. And in 2 Corinthians 4:19, one of those, he mentions that Aquila and Priscilla, the church meet in their homes. But he always praises them as being fellow workers with him in the gospel, in the ministry. So they became very strong. They were missionaries on their own. Paul did these missionary journeys with several people and picked them up along the way. But they very well could have kind of just gone on their own wherever they were at. They had a church meeting in their home. And then the other thing that struck me about Aquila and Priscilla is the encouragement that they gave Paul while they were with him in Corinth. They had that connection of being a tent maker with him. They lived together with him for a while. He used their home as a base to go out and come back to go to the synagogue and other places to teach the gospel.
And Paul said he worked with his hands, and so he wasn't just a lazy person. And he did what he had to do to make a living, I guess, as he went along.
He did.
He was tempted for that.
And
He did a lot of work, I think, to show he was industrious.
I think it was in Corinthians where he defended his right to be supported by the church, but he chose not to do that. And because he could make money by being a tent maker, he did that. But then, like, he partnered with Aquila and Priscilla and lived out of their home. They may have supported him while he devoted his full time to the gospel. I kind of read that into this text too, where he stopped being a tent maker at some point and dedicated himself full time to going out and preaching and teaching because he had other means of support. But yes, he had the right to be supported by the church, and he defends that very strongly in the scriptures, but he chose not to do that simply because he didn't want to deal with that.
Where he went, so he could be this all the time.
It's kind of like being an undertaker. You always got business. So our time's about up. Are there any other questions or comments about this lesson this morning in Corinth with Paul? Good. I answered all your questions. Perfect. I'm enjoying this study through Acts. I think we've got 4 or 5 more lessons before we're finished with Acts, and I'm not even sure what we're going to do next. But I'm excited about studying with you together in our Bible class hour. Thank you for your participation in person and online. We will transition to worship in just a few minutes.